a virgin bride, crossed the plains alone, and returned with 300 warriors behind her. Marah ran before the sun touched the horizon, her wedding veil torn from branches as she fled the ranch where her uncle had sold her to a man twice her age. A man whose eyes had measured her like cattle, and whose hand had bruised her wrist during the vows she never agreed to speak. The horse she stole breathed hard beneath her, hooves striking the cold earth as she pushed toward the open plains, wind stinging her face, fear chasing her harder than any rider could. But she did not look back once, not even when the chapel bell rang behind her like a warning. She refused to obey, for she had promised her dying mother she would never live under a man who saw her as property. And tonight, that promise was the only thing keeping her upright. By midday, her horse stumbled, legs trembling, water gone, and Marah slipped off, guiding him by the reins across the wide, empty land where the sky felt too large and silence pressed against her ears until she wondered if she had outrun the world itself. She walked until her boots split, until her breath turned shallow, until the plains shimmered with heat that wasn't dust, but the kind that made the horizon wobble. And when she finally collapsed near a dry riverbed, she whispered, "I'm not dying here," though her voice barely reached the air. The horse nudged her shoulder once before wandering toward a patch of grass, leaving her alone, shaking, her heartbeat loud as thunder inside her chest. She laid her head against a smooth stone, clutching the only thing she'd carried from home, a small silver brooch shaped like a sunburst, and whispered her mother's name as her eyes drifted closed, unaware of the distant shapes gathering on the ridge above her, unaware of the soft rhythm of hooves approaching from the west, unaware that she was already being watched by riders whose painted faces carried no cruelty but curiosity. A deep voice spoke in a tongue she didn't know, and shadows moved around her. Then warmth touched her cheek as someone checked her breath. She forced her eyes open and saw a young warrior kneeling beside her, feathers in his black hair, eyes full of concern rather than threat. He murmured to another rider, then lifted her gently, as if she weighed less than the scarf tangled around her arm. Her voice cracked into the air, barely a whisper. "Please, don't take me back." And though he didn't understand her words, he understood her fear. And with a single command, the riders circled her in protection, turning their horses toward the west as the sun began to rise behind them. Marah woke to the scent of warm sage and a sky painted in early amber, her body wrapped in a soft buffalo hide blanket instead of the cold ground she remembered collapsing on. And for a moment, she didn't know if she had died or been carried into some dream. But then she heard voices, gentle, curious, speaking a language she didn't know. And she sat up slowly inside a hide tent where light filtered through the seams like threads of gold. Outside, the sound of horses and crackling fire blended with laughter that didn't feel dangerous. And when she pushed aside the flap, the world opened into a camp unlike anything she had ever imagined. Its people moving with purpose and calm, warriors polishing saddles, children carrying bowls of water, women grinding herbs under the open sky. The young warrior who had carried her, she recognized him by his feathered braid, approached with a bowl of warm broth, his eyes steady but kind, and though he didn't speak English, he gestured for her to drink, which she did, grateful for the warmth sliding down her throat. The elder woman beside him, her hair silver, touched Marah's cheek and murmured something soothing before handing her a clean dress of soft deer skin. And Marah changed behind a screen, her old torn clothes folded into a neat bundle as if they still deserved dignity. When she stepped out, the warrior's eyes softened with surprise, not desire. And that alone eased a fear she had carried her whole life. Soon a tall figure approached, The tribe's chief, his presence quiet yet powerful, his gaze sharp enough to read truths she hadn't spoken. And beside him stood a young woman about Marah's age, long braids swaying as she studied her with open curiosity. Through the woman's broken English, Marah learned that the young warrior was named Talon, and the chief was his uncle, and that they had found her near death on the plains, believing the wind had guided them to her. When the chief asked where she belonged, Marah hesitated, staring at the fire where smoke drifted upward like a prayer she didn't know how to speak, then whispered, "I have nowhere." And the chief exchanged a long look with Talon before giving a quiet nod. The young woman, Asha, smiled gently and said, "Then you stay until your heart knows its path." And relief washed through Marah so hard her knees weakened. That night, she lay beside the fire, in a circle of warmth she had not felt since childhood, listening to the drums echo beyond the hills, unaware that men from the ranch she'd fled were already days behind her, hunting the girl who dared run from the life they demanded she live. Marah adjusted slowly to life in Red Horizon, learning the rhythm of the camp through gestures, expressions, and the patient guidance of Asha, who treated her not as a burden, but as a sister finding her footing again. Mornings were filled with the sounds of sharpening blades, brushing horses, and the soft thud of drums that kept time with the rising sun. And in those hours, Talon often appeared, always silent yet always nearby, his presence steady as the earth beneath them, offering her water, food, or a place by the fire without ever intruding on her space. One afternoon, he found her struggling to braid her hair, made the way she saw the other women wear theirs, her fingers fumbling through strands made uneven by her escape, and without touching her. He knelt and placed a small carved hairpiece, shaped like a rising sun, on the ground between them, his eyes asking permission before he even tried to help. She nodded, heart stuttering, and he gently guided her hands, showing her how to twist the strands so they held tight. And for the first time in her life, a man's closeness didn't feel like a threat, but like a shelter she didn't know she needed. As days passed, Marah began to understand bits of their language. Words for fire, river, horse, courage. And Talon noticed her efforts, responding with patient nods or quiet smiles that flickered through her chest like light across water. One evening, as the sun dipped behind red cliffs, Talon led her to the edge of the plateau overlooking an endless stretch of plains, the wind carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. And he pointed toward the path she had come from, his expression darkening. Asha translated softly behind them, "He says, riders follow your trail." Marah's breath tightened, her fingers gripping the small sun-shaped brooch hidden in her pocket, and memories of the ranch returned in a rush. The forced vows, the rough hands, the man who claimed her like property. Talon stepped closer and tapped his chest lightly, then pointed at her. And though she couldn't understand every word he spoke, she felt the meaning. "You are safe here." Tears she had swallowed for days finally reached her eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming shock of being protected rather than pursued. Yet as night fell and the drums echoed in warning, a chill threaded through her. Because far to the east, on the same plateau, men searched for her with a fury that would not fade, and she feared she had brought danger to the only place that had ever felt like home. The warning came at dawn, not with shouts or chaos, but with the sudden stillness of the camp, an instinctive hush that fell over every tent as if the earth itself held its breath. And when Marah stepped outside, she saw Talon standing rigid near the horses, eyes fixed on the eastern ridge where faint dust trails curled upward like thin smoke. The chief joined him a heartbeat later, his jaw tightening as scouts rode in fast, their mounts lathered, their faces set in grim lines. And though she didn't understand their words, Marah heard her own name spoken again and again, carried with urgency through the cool morning air. Asha grabbed her arm gently but firmly, guiding her into the shadow of a large boulder as the camp shifted into silent formation. Women gathering children, warriors preparing bows and spears, the air humming with tension. When Talon approached her, his chest rising with controlled breaths, he lifted his hand in a gesture she had come to know meant truth, then pointed to the ridge and said slowly in accented English, "Men, come for you." Her stomach twisted, shame and fear mixing like cold water in her veins as she whispered, "I didn't mean to bring danger." But Talon shook his head, stepping closer, his voice firm. "Danger finds brave hearts." The chief spoke then, his voice low but commanding, and Asha translated, "They will not cross into our land without permission." Marah looked toward the ridge and recognized the silhouette of the ranch foreman, Darren Voss, the man who had tried to claim her as his bride, his broad hat and cruel posture unmistakable even from a distance. He rode with 6 armed men, rifles slung across saddles, confidence radiating off them as if the plains belonged only to those carrying iron. Talon glanced at her, his expression softening only for her, then hardened like stone as he strode away to join the warriors forming at the camp's edge. The chief raised his hand, and the camp went silent, waiting, watching. The crackle of the morning fire the only sound until Darren's voice carried across the plains, sharp and mocking. "We're here for the girl. Send her out, or we come through." Marah's breath caught, panic rising. But before she could speak, Asha squeezed her hand and whispered, "You are not his to claim." Talon stepped forward beside the chief, his voice calm but edged with steel as he answered in English learned for this moment. "She is under our protection." Darren spat into the dirt and raised his rifle, grinning, and though no shot was fired yet, the air felt charged with fire. Because one wrong word, one twitch of a finger, and the plains would burn with the spark of a war Marah had never meant to start. The standoff stretched like a drawn bowstring, every heartbeat loud enough for Marah to feel it in her throat as Talon and the warriors held their line, refusing to give an inch while Darren Voss smirked atop his horse, certain the world still bent to his will. A gust of clean morning wind swept across the plains, lifting Marah's hair as she stepped from behind the boulder, despite Asha's whispered warning, her feet moving before fear could stop them. And when Darren saw her, his grin widened with a cruel triumph that made her blood run cold. "There she is," he barked, lifting his chin at the chief. "Now hand her over. She's property of the Elling Ranch by legal oath." And though Marah knew he believed every word, her voice rose with unexpected strength as she shouted, "I never spoke those vows." Darren only laughed, turning to his men. "Girl thinks running changes anything. Contracts don't break just because she got scared of being a wife." The chief's eyes narrowed, understanding enough of the tone to feel the insult, even without knowing the words. And Asha quickly translated Marah's protest, her voice trembling with anger. Talon stepped forward then, shoulders squared, and to Marah's shock he spoke directly to Darren in broken but firm English. "Woman chooses her own path. Not yours, not any man's." A statement so absolute the warriors behind him murmured in approval. Darren's face darkened, his pride stung, and he jerked his reins, edging his horse closer to the line. "Last chance," he spat. "Move aside. We take the girl, and no one dies today." But the chief lifted his staff high, the carved eagle at the top catching sunlight. And the camp fell silent as he uttered a single command. Asha whispered urgently to Marah. He says, "If they force a fight, none of their men will leave these plains alive." And the truth of that made Marah's knees shake, because she now realized she hadn't brought danger to Red Horizon. Danger had followed her, hungry and arrogant and unwilling to let her choose her own life. Talon didn't wait for Darren to act. He stepped beside Marah, brushing her arm gently as he passed, then walked directly toward the ridge where the wind blew strongest, placing himself between her and every gun pointed her way. Darren's horse danced nervously, unsettled by Talon's unflinching calm, and for a moment even Darren hesitated, his arrogance flickering as he faced a man who refused to bow. Then he snarled, "Fine, mountain boy, if you want her so bad, you can die first." And the metallic click of rifles being cocked echoed across the plains like the first crack of a coming storm, a warning that the choice made today would carve its memory into the land forever. The camp did not sleep. Firelight cut faces into hard plains, and the air tasted of sage and iron. And Marah felt the weight of what she had chosen settle in her like a second skin. Talon moved through the small rings of men with quiet authority, mapping routes for scouts and naming who would watch which ridge when the dawn came. While Asha sat near Marah and tidied the small cuts on her palms with steady fingers, humming a low song that smelled like corn and smoke, and kept the worst of the fear from growing teeth. The chief sat with a cup of bitter tea and listened as elders argued soft corrections into Talon's plan. Riders to test the ridgeline at first light, a hidden ford where children could cross if needed, a place behind the broken but steady cottonwood, where the older women would wait. Children clustered in blankets at the camp's edge, eyes heavy but curious, trading whispers about the woman who had come from the plains and the men who called her property. And Marah drew courage from each small face, swallowing the panic that rose like a tide. She walked the circle and met strangers who had warmed to her in days. Each nod and small smile gave a crooked strength that stitched into the courage already at her core. Talon found her at the rim and did not speak at first. He simply rested his hand on her shoulder in a promise that needed no language. And when he finally said, "We stand together," the phrase felt more like a vow than any line written on a contract. They traded plans and small comforts. Which songs to sing if children needed quieting, which herbs to press into wounds, where the smoke from a cooking fire should be placed so it looked natural, yet hid the camp's true shape, because strategy must hold room for tenderness, or else fear eats it alive. Before the embers cooled, Marah pulled the tiny silver sun from beneath her dress and pressed it into Talon's palm, not as surrender, but as a charge. "Carry this," she wanted to say. "Carry what you know of me into the morning." He tucked the brooch into his pouch near his heart, and his fingers closed in a way that made the action feel more binding than any law the ranch had printed. Far to the east, under a sky Marah could not see from the hollow where she now lay, men tightened girths and set teeth, and horses stamped as if tasting a storm. The riders' silhouettes rode like dark teeth along the ridge. Back in red horizon, the drums beat low and steady, a single sound that was both promise and warning. And Marah lay down on her blanket beneath a wide vault of stars and let the night gather itself to meet the morning, whatever it might bring. Marah rose before the sky even thought of brightening, her breath clouding in the cool air as she wrapped the deerskin shawl around her shoulders, feeling the weight of the coming sunrise like a hand pressing against her spine. The camp murmured in hushed movement. Warriors tightening straps, children tucked into the safety circle near the cottonwood, women passing water and steadying trembling hands, and Talon stood at the edge of the ridge like a carved promise. The silver sun brooch she had given him glinting faintly against his chest. When she approached, he turned, and in his dark eyes she saw no fear, only decision, carved deep as canyon stone. Asha joined them, her voice firm as she translated the chief's words. "He says dawn will show whether men choose pride or peace." And Marah swallowed hard, staring toward the east where darkness pressed thick, hiding the approach of those who believed she belonged to them. Guilt clawed at her throat. She whispered, "I never wanted anyone to bleed for me." But Talon stepped closer, touching 2 fingers to his chest and then to hers, a gesture he had used before yet, which now felt heavier, fuller. She didn't know the exact translation, but her heart understood. Your life matters. Still, a truth she had been holding in her ribcage finally cracked free, and she confessed in a trembling voice, "If I go back, they won't fight. They'll leave you alone." Asha's breath caught. "You would return?" Marah nodded, tears burning but unfallen. "If it ends the danger, yes." Talon's reaction was swift and fierce, his jaw tightening, his hand closing around her wrist with a grip gentle but unyielding as he shook his head sharply, speaking a stream of words that needed no translation. The chief joined them, eyes grave, and Asha whispered, "He says a person who runs from cruelty is not the cause of war. Cruelty is." Marah's knees weakened, and Talon steadied her, his touch warm through the morning chill. "If I surrender myself," she whispered, "maybe they'll stop." Talon closed his eyes, breathing once, twice, as if steadying the earth beneath them, then placed her hand over the brooch on his chest. He murmured a single phrase, "Not yours to give." She understood. Her freedom wasn't a bargaining chip. Her life didn't belong to Darren Voss or the men who rode with him. And though fear still pulsed in her veins, it had nowhere left to root. When the first beam of daylight broke across the plains, touching the camp in a soft golden thread, Marah lifted her chin and said, "Then I'll stand with you." Asha exhaled like someone witnessing a legend's first breath, and Talon bowed his head once, not in command, but in respect, as the drums began their slow rise, welcoming the day that would demand everything they carried inside their hearts. The sun rose like a blade, cutting through the last veil of night as Darren Voss and his men crested the ridge, rifles gleaming in the early light, their silhouettes sharp against the brightening sky, while the warriors of Red Horizon stepped forward in disciplined formation, spears angled low, bows drawn but not loosed, every movement calm and deliberate. Marah stood between Talon and Asha, her heartbeat loud as hoofbeats inside her chest, but her spine held straight, her breath steady, the cold morning air filling her with something that felt dangerously close to courage. Darren saw her first and barked a bitter laugh, riding down the slope with arrogance, dripping from every line of his body, shouting, "Look at you, hiding behind savages. You think they'll protect you when lead starts flying." Talon didn't flinch, didn't blink, simply stepped forward with the brooch glinting at his chest and said, in his hard, careful English, "No man owns her." Each word a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward. Darren sneered, lowering his rifle slightly as he spit into the grass. "You speak pretty for someone who'll be dead in a minute. Move aside. She comes with us." Marah stepped forward before Talon could stop her, voice cracking but loud enough to carry. "I will never belong to you." Darren's expression darkened to something uglier than anger. Wounded pride, the kind that turns men violent. And he jerked the rifle into position, aiming straight for Talon's heart. Time slowed, the plains holding their breath, warriors shifting like taut bowstrings ready to snap, and Marah saw Darren's finger tighten against the trigger. Without thinking, she moved, planting herself between the barrel and Talon, arms spread, voice tearing through the morning. "If you kill him, you kill me too." Darren froze, not from mercy, but from shock, long enough for the chief to raise his staff and shout a command that echoed across the grass. Dozens of warriors stepped forward at once, forming a half-moon shield around Talon and Marah, arrows aimed at every man Darren brought. Darren's horse stamped nervously beneath him. sensing the shift in power as the warriors advanced with synchronized precision, their shadows long and unbroken in the rising sun. "You fire that gun," Asha warned, her voice ice and iron, "and this land becomes your grave." For the first time since arriving, Darren hesitated, glancing between the wall of warriors and the woman he had tried to claim. No fear shone in Marah's eyes now, only fierce clarity. Talon stepped beside her, placing his palm on her back, grounding her, claiming nothing yet protecting everything. The world teetered in that breath, balanced between peace and bloodshed, waiting to see which direction the dawn would choose. The standoff shattered not with a gunshot, but with the thunder of hooves rising from beyond the far ridge. Distant at first, then swelling into a roar that made even Darren's horse sidestep in fear. And every head turned as the horizon darkened with riders, hundreds of them, fanning across the plains in a formation so vast it looked like a moving river of painted shields and lifted spears. Marah's breath caught, her hand instinctively gripping Talon's arm as Asha whispered in awe. "The clans, all of them." And Talon's eyes widened with the same shock, because no one had summoned these riders. Yet here they were, cresting the hills with the rising sun behind them like a curtain of fire and gold. At their lead rode a towering elder draped in white feathers, his horse marked in symbols of unity. And when the warriors reached the lower slope, they slowed, forming a perfect arc that enclosed the entire valley. 300 strong, their presence silent but overwhelming. The kind of force that history itself turned to witness. Darren's men paled, their bravado draining from their faces as they realized they weren't facing a single camp or a handful of archers. They were surrounded by an army that had crossed miles to answer a call no one had spoken aloud. The elder rode forward, and the chief of Red Horizon met him halfway, their hands touching briefly in the greeting of shared purpose. Asha listened, then murmured, "They say the plains carried word of a woman running from cruelty, and they saw it as a sign." And Marah's knees weakened at the idea that her flight across a lonely landscape had somehow summoned this river of strength. The elder turned his horse toward her, studying her with eyes that held storm and sunrise both. And he spoke directly to her in halting English. "You ran with courage. We ride with you now." Darren's face twisted with panic. This is madness. She's just a girl. She ain't worth all this. But even he could hear the hollowness in his own voice. Because the warriors stood like carved stone, unmoving, unafraid, watching him with the calm certainty of men who had already accepted the outcome. Talon stepped forward then, jaw set, voice steady as he declared, "She crossed the plains alone. She returned with nations behind her. You will leave her be." Darren's gaze flicked desperately between the encircling riders, the chief's staff raised like a verdict, and Marah's unbroken stance at Talon's side. The reality settled on him like a crushing weight. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was mercy being offered one last time. Slowly, with hands trembling in rage and humiliation, he lowered his rifle, and behind him, his men followed, their weapons dropping like brittle branches against the grass. Darren Voss backed his horse away, as if the very ground beneath him had turned to fire. His men following in a stumbling retreat, none daring to look at the 300 riders who watched them with unblinking resolve. And when the last of their figures disappeared over the ridge, a long-held breath seemed to leave the valley itself, the tension dissolving like frost under sun. Marah stood rooted in place, trembling not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what had just unfolded. How a girl who had once been sold like livestock now stood surrounded by nations who had chosen to guard her freedom with their own lives. The elder dipped his head to her, the feathers in his hair swaying gently in the morning breeze as he said, "Courage is not born. It is remembered," before turning his horse to address the gathered riders with a single command that sent their spears rising in unison. The sky briefly filled with the glint of polished stone and sunlight. Talon approached her slowly, as if afraid she might vanish like a mirage, and when he reached her, he didn't speak. He simply placed his hand over his heart, then over hers, a vow without sound. And something inside her settled into place, a sense of belonging so strong it warmed her from the inside out. Asha threw her arms around Marah in a fierce embrace, laughing with relief and wiping tears that weren't entirely her own. While the chief raised his staff high, declaring that the plains had chosen peace today, not through conquest, but through courage. As the riders dispersed into smaller groups, returning to their homelands with the story of a runaway bride who crossed the plains alone and came back with justice at her heels, Marah walked with Talon to the edge of the river, where waters shimmered like polished glass and the world finally felt safe enough for her to breathe fully. She took out the sun-shaped brooch and studied its bright edges. No longer a symbol of the life she'd fled, but of the one she had claimed. "I thought I was running to survive," she whispered. "But maybe I was running toward who I was meant to become." And Talon touched her hand, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he answered in soft, halting English. "You become strong, because your hearts stay true." Marah looked across the valley where warriors rode home beneath the rising sunlight. And for the first time in her life, she felt the plains breathe with her, warm and wide and full of possibility. When Talon offered his hand, she took it without hesitation, stepping into the future not as someone's possession, but as a woman carried by her own courage, a woman who had crossed fear, found family, and rewritten the meaning of freedom beneath the boundless western sky. If this story found a place in your heart, where courage becomes identity and freedom is earned through fire, another tale waits for you on Crimson West. Subscribe for more frontier stories where the brave are never forgotten and the lost find their way home.